Welcome, and I believe you're all going to come and walk the centuries with me. So therefore I better tell you a little bit about myself. I am upwards of 500 years old. I have witnessed stories throughout the centuries, and I'm going to tell you some of those stories today. And the story that links all the other stories together starts with the bells that call that tower their home. Now I've got to tell you a sadness, they're not in at the moment, them bells. They're not home. They've been out on, let's call it an extended spa holiday, if you like. They've had lots of care and attention and a great deal of money spent on them. The church that you can see here, that's the church of St. Peter and St. Mary. And for the most part, this church has stood here for 650 years. In some places, bells were sent away in the 18th and 19th century. Sometimes they sent their bells away and they'd send them all at once to get melted down and recast, and then they would come back all bearing the same date stamp and all with the same maker's mark on them. But that didn't happen here for some reason, I don't know why. But the bells that live here, they are dated throughout the centuries. And the oldest one of all, let me tell you, dates from the year 1450. That's 572 years old. You can do the maths when you get home. This is the market square here. Stowmarket was never one of those wool towns, those rich wool towns, but it always kind of benefited from the knock-on of being not far away from them wool towns. So the rich wool merchants would, they'd make their money in Lavenham or Hadley or Clare, Long Melford, and then on the way passing through, they'd come and spend it, some of it here in the market. You do, of course, get the occasional dodgy character. So if I were you, I wouldn't buy anything from these two here.
Any time you packed up and got going, Jen? Has anyone left here who's going to buy those tatty nose wipes?
Looking your nose out, Alice Spencer. I'm only hanging around here now to see if there's any fruit left over. Fancy making a drop of cider.
Now then, in some places we know that they would ring a bell for the start and the close of trading. I don't know if that ever happened here, I'll be honest with you, I was never up early enough. But what we do know is that the bell would have rung a curfew, because it rang in every parish. Around about 8 o'clock on a night, the bell was rung, and that meant it was the end of the working day. Originally, right back at the time of King Alfred the Great, that was a law. You had to be inside after the curfew bell. And what you had to do was cover your fire, couvre-feu, yeah, or curfew, that's where the word comes. Every day's a school day, ain't it, madam? Every day's a school day. So you would cover your fire, and then you would go back inside. This house that you can just about see through the trees there, that's called Abbott's Hall. And that particular house there, that stood there for about 300 odd years. That's a Queen Anne house. But long before those bricks stood there, there was a range of buildings here that were ready to house any passing abbot.
Good people of Stowmarket, how happy I am that you have gathered here to greet me. We have travelled for many hours to reach you, although my horse and I are both weary. We could not let this day go past without joining you in celebration of the arrival of your new bells. Bells ring out to call us to prayer, to honour our dead, to act as markers to our lives.
So this rather beautiful house at the end here, that's known as Red Gables. Originally though, when it was first built in 1858, it was a private house. It belonged to the Prentice family. One of the things they did was own a factory not very far from here by the river. And the factory made a substance called gun cotton. Gun cotton was a kind of explosive, looked a bit like cotton wool, but it was very volatile in the production process. There were 28 people killed that day in 1871 when the gun cotton factory exploded. Many of them were children, teenagers. And there was an inquest, of course, and the lawyers decided that no one was really to blame. They did decide, though, that it might have been the particularly hot weather that caused the explosions. What they did say was that never again should a factory so dangerous be built so close to a busy town. 23 of the dead were from this parish, and many a funeral knell sounded for them. Right then, this funny old hodgepodge of a building, look at this. This has had bits in it from my century, bits in it, certainly a coat of paint, looks like it's been added in your century. Nowadays, it's where you can come to register a birth or a marriage. But way back in the 1600s, this was the home of the vicar of Stowmarket at the time. He was a man called Reverend Dr. Thomas Young, but he'd been a tutor at Cambridge. And one of his ex-students used to come and visit him quite often here. The young student went on to be something of a writer of note in his own right, and indeed is most famous for a very long and rather wordy poem, and that poem was called Paradise Lost. So altogether, you got to tell me what his name was? John Milton.
And how are you, my old friend? Still causing trouble, I hope.
Well, if not us, then whom, Johnny? But I want to hear stories of your trip around Europe. I suppose you've added 2 or 3 more languages to your collection?
I could get by passably well using the Latin you taught me as a child. But I thought it was time to come home. Apart from feeling that after what I had written about their religion, I probably wouldn't be too welcome in Rome. The sad tidings of the Civil War here in England reached us on the continent, and I felt I needed to return.
Now, at that time, when John Milton was writing, the country was in turmoil. Political upheaval that's not really ever been seen since. There were some people who believed that the king, or the idea even of a king or a queen, was an outdated thing. Our John Milton here, he worked for the parliamentary cause. He believed that the king was a waste of money, as indeed at the time did most people in Suffolk. Eventually there were battles, skirmishes, and the king was executed. The man who took over his job was an elected minister. He was called Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan. He was very, very strict. And eventually, in 1660, a king was restored to the throne. And for many centuries after, they celebrated the day that the king had been restored to the throne.
Well, I hope you're all not in a hurry. I'm going off down to church now because I'm going to decorate the door with this, because that's Oak Apple Day coming up soon. You might know it as Chic Shack Day, or you might know it as Pinch Bum Day. Or you, madam, you look awfully sophisticated, you may know it as Restoration Day. So our church door will have all this round it and be decorated, and I shall wear a sprig of oak in my collar. And the church bells, they're going to ring out at dawn to remind us to thank the Lord that we can sing and dance and be a bit merry.
Now this stretch of water here, this is part of the River Gipping, and by the time it gets to Ipswich, it is the River Orwell. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, of course, the town, as we know, was expanding as an industrial town. And they thought it would be a smart idea to make it easier to bring goods up and down the river from Ipswich, especially seeing as the docks were down at Ipswich. So they started to turn the river into a canal. All manner of things were brought up and down the river. Coal was brought up and down, hops were brought up and down, and of course gun cotton, which we heard about earlier. But most importantly, malt was transported, which meant that Stowmarket, little tiny Stowmarket in the middle of nowhere, became second only to Burton-on-Trent for the production of malt for brewing beer. So the building we're looking at now is that rather imposing looking house over on the corner there. That house has stood there for about 300 years, and it's the townhouse that belonged to a family called the Tyrrell family. And the most famous, or shall we say notorious member of that family is a man called Sir James Tyrrell, and he was living around about the time of the Wars of the Roses. He was born, in fact, not very long distant from our earliest bell, and I'm going to ask one of these lads here, what's the date of the earliest bell?
1540.
Nearly.
1450.
1450, that's right, you got the numbers nearly the wrong way around. 1450. During the Wars of the Roses, he found himself on the side of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was one of the Yorkists, who went on, you'll remember, to become Richard III. But he couldn't have taken up that position without getting rid of a few people on the way. And one of the people he had to get rid of to get the position of king was a young prince who, with his brother, was locked in the Tower of London, and they were murdered there. And allegedly, Sir James Tyrrell was complicit in that murder. The story says that he confessed to it, but no confession was ever found, so we don't really know for certain. Later on, in the great shenanigans that was the Wars of the Roses, he sides with the Duke of Suffolk, who at the time was a rival to King Henry VII, for which treason he was executed in 1502 in London. But I can't help thinking that as a member of such an illustrious local family, the bells would have rung for Sir James Tyrrell. So here we are back to where we started, right close to that tower where the bells are going to be soon restored in their grandeur. There will be 12 of them, 10 in the main peal, and that's the bit that makes the tunes that you hear when there's a wedding. And they range from the number 1 bell, which is the highest little treble bell, right down to the number 10 bell, which is the lowest tenor bell. But for all those years, 572 years, these bells have rung out to celebrate the activity of this wonderful little town.
They rang for me when I passed through your town in 1578 to confer a knighthood on my good servant Thomas Rivet at one house.
That's pronounced Wallace, Your Majesty.
Indeed.
Really? How interesting. How very Suffolk.
And they rang for me when I came to your town during my Golden Jubilee year. I've been here twice, you know. Hello. Have you come far?
They rang out loud and clear in both joy and sorrow to celebrate the end of 2 terrible wars.
And they rang out at the stroke of 12 to welcome in the new millennium.
And they rang when my daughter said, I do. And one rings every Sunday to tell me that I'm late for church.
And long may they continue to ring out for each and every one of you.
Ring out for Suffolk!
Yes.